Everything began with a seemingly dry legal maneuver that cracked open a maze of feelings and power plays in Fairmont Crest when Ted decided to slow the divorce by demanding a full audit of the family's financial records. A move that shoved the ball back into Nicole's court and forced her to confront every line item, every expense, every asset created during the relationship, as well as those that were never truly marital property. And within that cold heap of data, one fact stood out: the house. Where Nicole was living, the place where she had thrown Ted out, was a separate asset held in Ted's name before any vows were made, meaning it did not sit inside the community pot to be split by habit, but remained a landmark of memory and title, a sovereign asset layered with history for its owner. From that firm footing, Ted's second plan surfaced, not merely to stall the divorce, but to rebuild a family order he believed could heal long-standing cracks by transferring the house to Leslie. So she and Eva had a safe anchor, at first a mailing address and, in time, a genuine home. More surprising still, a third thread in the story came from Eva, who had asked Ted to convince her mother not to buy the house directly across from Vernon and Anita. A request that sounded altruistic, a way to avoid needless friction. Yet when set beside her steady encouragement to return to Ted's old place, it traced a neat arc: step away from Anita's front yard line of sight to escape a powerful woman's constant oversight, then reclaim the territory of memory where Eva could hold safety in one hand and quietly widen her soft influence in this gated constellation. In the eyes of legal minds, Ted's transfer looked savvy because it kept separate property off the divorce battlefield. But in the eyes of those fluent in Fairmont Crest society, it was also a public declaration that he had chosen a side, that he intended to place mother and daughter back at the center of a new family circle, that he wanted to be a father again and would no longer let a hotel room's chill be his long-term shelter. The meeting between Ted and Leslie did not unfold in the gauzy air of recycled romance, but inside the layered defenses of a woman protecting herself while clinging to a modest hope of stability for Eva, particularly with Bill hovering near the threshold as a reminder that Fairmont Crest never stops watching and judging. Leslie had been angry at Bill for his crude threats to hound her out of town. And, by reflex, she saw in Ted the shadow of another accomplice in intimidation. But Ted, with the composure forged by isolation, brought her down from the ceiling of suspicion and laid out an unvarnished reality. With Nicole, every door had shut and that ship had sailed. Yet in the middle of wreckage he was grateful that Leslie kept the baby, because it meant the concept of family had not burned to ash. The offer to transfer the house was gratitude turned into a practical living plan, not a covert confession of love, because he said plainly he promised nothing romantic and simply refused to drift in a hotel any longer, that if all went well he might move in later as a responsible unit in which he could be a father, Leslie could be safe, and Eva could grow in calmer weather. For Leslie, it felt unbelievable because it hit her most basic need for a home while exposing another layer of Ted's intent. Not clinging to the past like the men of Fairmont Crest often do, but erecting new scaffolding so the future can stand. Beneath that promise, however, lay a question Leslie could not silence: whether she was just a piece in a larger design authored by Eva, who had nudged every chip into its proper square with seemingly harmless requests, first to avoid buying across from Anita, next to return to Ted's house, and finally to seal the arrangement with a benefit almost impossible to refuse. Eva entered this board not as a child clamoring for toys, but as an architect of feeling, longing to reconstruct a dream family shattered in childhood, with hallways, stair rails, and window frames of the old house carrying a sky of memories and a quiet constitution of soft power in Fairmont Crest. Urging her mother not to live opposite Vernon and Anita sounded like courtesy, but served as a sidestep from a theater where every movement would sit under Anita's microscope, while relocating to Ted's place created a private stage where Eva could invite or exclude key players, seed relationships, tune rhythms of visits, and reposition influence on her terms. From the familiar kitchen to the strip of garden that held summers of ease, Eva aimed not merely to reclaim time but to reinstall a social network, adjusting channels to Bill, to Vernon, to Anita, advancing when softness worked, holding still when steel was wiser, and above all placing Ted as the legitimate patron of the new family structure, so that those around her could no longer invoke only a past full of hurts. When naming her but would have to acknowledge her present standing, Meanwhile, Nicole kept a silence that made the town guess and second guess, and that silence was not empty. It was a legal and psychological strategy braided into a personal rhythm already on a new page as she appeared openly with Carlton, Ted's friend and colleague, a choice that invited talk of conflicts of interest yet set up a refined duel in Fairmont Crest's professional class. Nicole knew, or could not possibly fail to know, about Ted's plan to transfer the house, because no document of that weight slides through town unseen by someone in her line of work, and yet she did not shout, file threats, demand a temporary order, or post a veiled warning online, preferring to let the audit do its work, to allow facts to speak while she waited to see if her opponent would commit a procedural error. If the house was truly separate property, she might not block the transfer, but she could still examine whether any marital funds covered maintenance in ways that merited reimbursement or offset, and if there was even a faint scratch in the record of post-marital commingling, she would have leverage to tug the house back into debate. In that calculus, Carlton became a volatile variable, offering her emotional ballast while facing the ethical puzzle that every move could be read as striking at a former colleague for advantage, a murky pool the men of Fairmont Crest swim well yet rarely without a cough. Bill had no intention of watching from the sidelines, especially since his name had already surfaced in Leslie's anger as the man who would bully her out of town. He saw in Ted's decision a direct challenge to the unwritten code of Fairmont Crest, where the strong keep the knots of real estate as anchor stakes of influence, and the act of handing the house to Leslie looked like creating a new fulcrum for a family axis beyond his control. Bill understood that if Leslie and Eva planted their flag on Ted's territory, the bargaining power to push them out later would plummet, so he would work every information channel, from realtors to country club staff, to release sugar-hard rumors, recasting Ted's offer as a manipulative tug on Leslie's emotions, turning Leslie into a woman chasing profit by accepting a house from a man loose in his marriage, and painting Eva as someone cashing in on male fragility to get ahead. But gossip in Fairmont Crest rarely moves as its originators wish, and every time Bill tried to whip the tale into scandal, Anita appeared as a stabilizing variable, too practiced at peeling back veneers not to spot the toxic masculinity tucked inside gestures of so-called civic concern. At the legal level, Ted's plan was not without gaps and he knew it, so every document was drafted with care. Proofs of premarital origin, records of zero commingling, maintenance paid from separate accounts, and a transfer structure just transparent enough to avoid the whiff of fraud, just swift enough to create a fait accompli before the other side could drum up pressure. He weighed gifting the property directly to Leslie with conditions tied to Eva's residence, but his counsel recommended a safer route, placing the house into a family trust managed by a third party, with Leslie as beneficiary and clear use limits, reducing exposure to claims of evasion. At the same time, he asked Leslie to sign open-ended access commitments so he would not be barred from the space that had once been his, because a quiet fear in men fresh from divorce is becoming a stranger in every room. Through all these steps, the brightest point was his public acknowledgement of fatherhood as a central duty, an instinct both primal and relearned after wreckage, in which he accepted that paper can switch owners but only steady presence creates family. Leslie is not naive about the local rulebook, and she is not a starry-eyed romantic, so before signing anything she and Eva walked the house on a long afternoon of light, listening to the floorboards creak and the thin drift of cold from the walls, as if memory itself was trying to speak, insisting that this return could be more than an address and might be a right of repair. Eva touched the stairway rail where smaller feet once climbed, looked through the window onto the patch of yard where she first pedaled and fell, and wondered whether these rooms still had enough living spirit to hold a new version of them or had been sanded flat by time, and in that pause her resolve formed. The house would not be a museum of days gone, it would be a forge where a family with new standards could be cast, and to defend that forge she was ready to face Bill's scrutiny, Anita's nudges, Vernon's quiet lessons, and even whatever tests Nicole might bring. Thus, when they signed their initial occupancy while the trust documents were finalizing, Leslie and Eva also signed a living plan. Medical appointments if needed, school rhythms, Leslie's work calendar, a list of who could visit, and a principle of open-door flexibility for Ted without a rigid schedule, so he could drop in when work allowed. a life schedule proving the people involved would not let emotions drive blind but would structure everything with cool practicality. Nicole watched those steps not with jealousy or bitterness. She had already stepped out of that chapter, but with the eye of someone who had shared the same financial system long enough to recognize its weak joins. She poured her focus into the audit, where joint and separate accounts exposed every track, and here her advantage surfaced. A few home maintenance payments had been made during the marriage from a blended account, items the other side would frame as temporary living needs but that her team could read as evidence of commingling sufficient to seek reimbursement or offsets. She did not necessarily want to drag the house into full dispute, since that war could turn filthy, but she aimed to leverage the data toward other targets that mattered more to her. Income-producing assets, perhaps, or standings in shared ventures, and here Carlton offered rare tempered advice. Pick winnable battles in cash flow territory rather than noisy symbols that drain attention. Nicole chose calm not as capitulation but as confidence that a report filed at the right moment would outweigh public theatrics, and while waiting she allowed herself a few quiet evenings with Carlton as a way to confirm that a new path does not need to shout to exist. Vernon and Anita observed from the home across the way that Eva did not want her mother to buy, watching with eyes blended by many storm seasons of Fairmont Crest. Vernon, steady as ever, saw in Ted an effort at atonement and in Leslie a dignified need for recognition, and he inclined not to intervene so long as boundaries were respected. Anita was different, reading the undertow quickly and recognizing that Eva was rebuilding a social web in her own way, which is not dangerous if it grows within her rules but could become a challenge if it breaks the choreography she has curated for years. Thus Anita would not oppose, but would smile and invite Leslie and Eva into a few civic projects, pulling them into an orbit where she remains the sun and every satellite must tune its tilt, both a test and an opportunity for the pair to prove they have come to build rather than to skew the laborious rules elders set. In that interaction, the quiet beneficiary might be Ted, because Anita's stabilizing presence weakens Bill's emotional broadsides, making the prospect of a peaceful dinner at the country club less a fantasy. A month passed as the paperwork ripened. The trust transfer closed, court dates for the divorce were set, tabloids tired of a scandal that no longer juiced views moved on, and just as many had pictured, on a tempered evening Ted walked into the country club with Leslie and Eva, not arm in arm, not with a banner of family, but shoulder to shoulder in a soft cadence respectful of fresh feelings and firm enough to signal the path ahead. There were, of course, eyes trailing them, chins tilted with subtext, and a few social smiles pitched, a note too high, but there were also sincere nods from people who had stood on the mud shore of divorce and understood that the best thing a man can sometimes do is not keep an unhappy marriage but raise a house that is truly a home for those tied to his duty. Leslie, in a dress without fuss, settled calmly, closed her fingers around Eva's small hand beneath the table like a discreet rite of reassurance, and Ted ordered a house favorite as if he had done this many times with others but was only now learning the feeling of a dinner that wasn't a performance but a steady breath worth keeping. The backdrop to that moment was not as smooth as the lake's surface. At home, Nicole and her team flipped through the audit one last time and prepared to file offset proposals based on small yet meaningful traces of financial blending, a sensible move that would not spark a media bonfire yet would protect her interests without dragging everyone into chaos. Carlton, rather than pushing, set timelines, and reminded Nicole to hold her steady rhythm because composure is the best long-range strategy in Fairmont Crest, where every emotional squall becomes quick fireworks in the rumor ecology. Bill, unwilling to let the story fade quietly, might take another media swing at Leslie's past or spread a whisper about Eva's motive, but the harder he tried the more he painted himself as a man so obsessed with control he lost his poise, a slip someone like Anita would not ignore as she guards the community's aesthetic order. Vernon would likely invite Ted for a whiskey on another day, not to praise but to remind him that in Fairmont Crest building a family is as public as it is private, and that men are measured not only by the houses they hold but by whom they open those doors to and how they balance gratitude, respect, and limits. Thus, the small-seeming story of a house became a barometer of many people's maturity. Ted, learning to place fatherhood above the hunger for instant comfort. Leslie, accepting protection without surrendering sovereignty. Eva, turning memory into a compass for the future without weaponizing pain. Nicole, practicing strategic quiet and letting the law do its work. Carlton, keeping professional lines in a town that loves to bend them. Bill, forced to stare into his own mirror of power. Anita and Vernon, enduring the constant test of preserving order without snuffing out families on the rise. And behind them all, Fairmont Crest itself, a setting that never merely sits still, where each private gesture echoes in public, where who lives in which house, across from whose lawn, near or far from the club, writes the unspoken constitution of the community. Which is why Ted's transfer to Leslie is not an ending but the opening of a new phase, where shared meals, laughter, anger, tears, and family meetings will test the tensile strength of commitments, and if someday the social handshakes of tonight deepen into something more, it will only be after they've lived together as reasonable people in a town that has never been easy, a town where everyone must learn to write the story of a life in coherent lines, low on display, rich in responsibility, always remembering that a house becomes a home only when its door opens onto a family that knows how to respect one another.